Boogeyman of Worcester, a name that sends shivers down the spine of anyone who hears it. This chilling moniker belongs to none other than Albert Fish, a man whose very existence seemed to be a testament to the darkest corners of human nature. Albert Fish was a notorious American serial killer active during the 1920s and 1930s. Born in 1870, Fish's life was marred by a series of disturbing events and behaviors that would eventually culminate in his transformation into one of the most feared criminals in American history. He was known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Boogeyman because of the horrific nature of his crimes. These nicknames were not just for show, they reflected the sheer terror he instilled in the hearts of those who knew of his deeds. Fish's crimes were not just acts of violence, they were acts of pure evil, designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering. Fish preyed on children, subjecting them to unimaginable acts of cruelty and violence. His methods were as varied as they were gruesome, and his victims were often left in a state of utter despair. The psychological torment he inflicted was as devastating as the physical harm, leaving scars that would never heal. He was a monster in human form, leaving a trail of devastation and heartbreak in his wake. Families were torn apart, communities were left in fear, and the very fabric of society seemed to unravel in the face of his atrocities. Fish's ability to blend into society, to appear as just another face in the crowd, made his actions all the more terrifying. His case shocked the nation, exposing the dark underbelly of society and the terrifying reality that monsters could lurk in the shadows, disguised as ordinary people. The trial of Albert Fish was a media sensation, drawing attention from all corners of the country. People were horrified to learn of the true extent of his crimes, and the courtroom was filled with an air of palpable tension as the details of his actions were laid bare. The judge, jury, and spectators were all left in a state of shock as they listened to the harrowing testimonies and examined the evidence. Fish's demeanor in court was chilling. He showed no remorse, no sign of guilt, only a cold, calculating presence that seemed to revel in the chaos he had caused. Ultimately, Albert Fish was found guilty and sentenced to death. His execution was seen as a necessary end to a chapter of horror that had gripped the nation. Yet, even in death, the legend of the Boogeyman of Worcester lived on, a grim reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human soul. The story of Albert Fish serves as a cautionary tale, a stark warning of the potential for evil that exists in the world. It reminds us to remain vigilant, to protect the innocent, and to never forget that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those who walk among us, hidden in plain sight. A troubled beginning. Born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., his early years were marked by a series of unfortunate events that would shape his future in unimaginable ways. His life seemed destined for darkness, a path paved with sorrow and despair from the very beginning. His family had a history of mental illness, a shadow that loomed over his childhood. His mother suffered from auditory and visual hallucinations, while other relatives were diagnosed with various psychological disorders. His father, Randall Fish, was much older than his mother, Ellen Fish. Randall was 75 years old when Albert was born, and his advanced age meant that he was not as involved in Albert's upbringing as a younger father might have been. Tragically, Randall died when Albert was just 5 years old, leaving a void in the young boy's life. This left his mother struggling to care for him and his siblings. Ellen, now a widow, found it increasingly difficult to provide for her family. The financial and emotional strain took its toll, and she was forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. She eventually placed him in an orphanage, a decision that would have a profound impact on his development. The orphanage was not a place of refuge but rather a harsh environment where young Albert would face unimaginable hardships. Orphanages in the late 19th century were often harsh and unforgiving places. The conditions were deplorable, with overcrowded rooms, inadequate food, and little to no emotional support for the children. Young Albert was subjected to physical and emotional abuse. The staff at the orphanage were often cruel, using corporal punishment as a means of control. Albert was frequently beaten and humiliated, experiences that would leave deep psychological scars. He later claimed that it was during this time that he began to find pleasure in pain. The constant abuse and neglect twisted his young mind, leading him to associate pain with pleasure. This disturbing development would be a precursor to the dark path he would eventually follow. While other children played and formed bonds, Albert became increasingly isolated. The lack of nurturing and the constant abuse made it difficult for him to form healthy relationships. He withdrew into himself, finding solace in his own dark thoughts. The psychological impact of his early years cannot be overstated. The trauma he experienced at the orphanage would shape his personality and behavior for the rest of his life. It was a troubled beginning that set the stage for a life filled with darkness and depravity. As he grew older, the seeds of his troubled childhood began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. The combination of a family history of mental illness, the loss of his father, and the abuse he suffered at the orphanage created a perfect storm of psychological torment. Albert Fish would go on to become one of the most notorious figures in criminal history. His early years, marked by tragedy and abuse, were just the beginning of a life that would be defined by unimaginable horror. A troubled beginning indeed for a man whose name would become synonymous with terror. Descent into darkness. As Albert grew older, his behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He began to exhibit signs of mental illness. He developed an unhealthy fascination with pain and suffering, both his own and that of others. He started by torturing animals, a common precursor to violence against humans. By his early 20s, Fish had begun engaging in criminal activities. Petty theft led to more serious offenses, including burglary and sexual assault. He drifted from place to place, a dark cloud following him wherever he went. The abduction of Grace Budd. In 1928, Albert Fish committed the crime that would seal his fate and forever etch his name into the annals of American criminal history. This was not just any crime, it was an act so heinous that it would leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the nation. Fish targeted the Budd family, a working-class family living in New York City. The Budds were an ordinary family, struggling to make ends meet in the bustling metropolis. They had no idea that their lives were about to be shattered by a man who appeared to be nothing more than a harmless, elderly gentleman. Posing as a friendly old man, Fish gained the trust of 10-year-old Grace Budd. He was a master manipulator, using his seemingly benign appearance to lull his victims into a false sense of security. Grace, like many children of her age, was innocent and trusting, qualities that Fish exploited to his advantage. He promised her parents he would take her to a birthday party, but instead, he took her to an abandoned house in Westchester County. The Budds, unaware of the true nature of the man they had entrusted with their daughter, believed his story. They could not have imagined the horrors that awaited their little girl. It was there, in the isolation of that desolate house, that Fish committed his most horrific act. He murdered and then dismembered young Grace, an act of such brutality that it defies comprehension. The details of the crime are so disturbing that they continue to haunt those who hear them, even decades later. He later admitted to cannibalizing her remains, a detail so gruesome it sent shockwaves across the nation. The revelation of his actions led to a media frenzy, with newspapers across the country reporting on the macabre details of the case. The courtroom was packed with people eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had committed such unspeakable acts. The trial was a spectacle, with every gruesome detail laid bare for the world to see. Fish's confession and the subsequent trial highlighted the depths of human depravity, leaving an indelible mark on the American psyche. The case of Grace Budd remains one of the most chilling and tragic stories in the annals of true crime, a stark reminder of the evil that can lurk behind the most unassuming of facades. For 6 years, the case of Grace Budd's disappearance remained unsolved. Her family was left with agonizing questions, their grief compounded by the lack of answers. Little did they know that the monster responsible for their daughter's death was still out there, living a seemingly normal life. But Fish's dark secret was eating away at him. He began sending taunting letters to Grace's mother, describing in graphic detail what he had done to her daughter. The letters were filled with depravity and madness, revealing the true extent of Fish's depravity. The letters were a crucial mistake. They provided the police with a vital clue. Fish's writing style, with its distinctive flourishes and misspellings, was traced back to him. Finally, after years of searching, the police had their man. When they arrived at his apartment to arrest him, they found a man who seemed unremarkable. He was small and frail, with a gentle demeanor that belied the monster lurking within. Fish's trial was a media sensation. Reporters and spectators flocked to the courtroom, eager to catch a glimpse of the man dubbed the most vicious maniac in criminal history. Fish's defense attorneys attempted to portray him as insane, but the jury was unconvinced. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Fish himself seemed unconcerned with the proceedings, often dozing off during the trial. He seemed to relish the attention, his twisted mind finding pleasure in the notoriety. Inside the mind of a monster. What drove Albert Fish to commit such unspeakable acts? Psychiatrists who examined him were baffled by the depths of his depravity. Some speculated that he suffered from a severe form of schizophrenia, while others pointed to his traumatic childhood and history of mental illness. Fish himself claimed to be possessed by demons, driven by voices in his head that commanded him to kill. Whatever the explanation, Fish's case provided a chilling glimpse into the dark recesses of the human psyche. A legacy of terror. On January 15, 1936, Albert Fish was executed by electric chair at Sing Sing prison in New York. He went to his death calmly, showing no remorse for his crimes. His execution marked the end of his reign of terror, but the scars he left on society ran deep. The case of Albert Fish became a cautionary tale, a reminder that monsters could be hiding in plain sight. It also highlighted the need for a greater understanding of criminal psychology and the factors that contribute to violent behavior. The evolution of criminal profiling. The case of Albert Fish had a profound impact on the field of criminal profiling. Prior to Fish's capture, law enforcement agencies relied heavily on eyewitness accounts and physical evidence to solve crimes. However, Fish's case demonstrated the importance of understanding the criminal mind. His taunting letters, filled with details only the killer could know, provided investigators with valuable insights into his psyche. This led to a greater emphasis on psychological profiling, a technique that is still used today to catch criminals. Never forgotten, the name Albert Fish continues to send chills down spines even today. He remains one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, a symbol of pure evil. His case serves as a stark reminder of the dark side of human nature and the importance of vigilance and protection, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable members of society. The legacy of Albert Fish is a haunting reminder that the world can be a dangerous place, and that monsters can lurk in the shadows, waiting to